I will be sharing the recording out to everyone who registered to attend. So whether you could be here or you couldn't be here, and I will send that out and let your sales rep know that you attended and that you might have interest in TimberScan. And please feel free to share it with your colleagues if you think there's people that you work with that would be interested in learning more about TimberScan. Please feel free to share. Everyone on the call is on mute except the presenter. If you have questions during the presentation, please go ahead and use the chat feature, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. And when it makes sense to stop the presentation, we'll go ahead and ask those questions. So today we have Mike to present. He's a senior product director for AvidXchange. He's going to give you a short presentation on what TimberScan Titanium is, and then he's going to proceed with a demo. So that's it for me. So I'm going to pass the torch over to Mike, and I'm going to unmute you. And I'm going to make you the presenter. So you should have control now.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy.
You're welcome.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your day. We're going to, as Amy said, we're going to go through a brief PowerPoint presentation just to talk through a couple of slides regarding titanium, and then we will jump right into the product. We'll spend most of the next, say, 45 minutes or so walking through titanium in quite a bit of detail. So let's get started with view of my screen. You should be able to see my PowerPoint. I'll go ahead and...
Yep, you're all set.
Very good. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so as we said, we're going to start with a brief PowerPoint presentation talking about titanium before we get into the product. I also think it's worth mentioning that we have had a long-standing relationship, Aktion Associates and the TimberScan, we'll call it the TimberScan family, which includes titanium for Acumatica. Now, we have many clients, common clients that we've worked together with, and so as you move forward with any questions as far as product references, those types of things, we are more than happy to share all that information. So with that, let's go ahead, and I think it's also worth mentioning that the product TimberScan was actually created by a company called Core Associates. You may have heard of them. And a couple of years ago, Core Associates was acquired by AvidXchange. The beauty of that acquisition is that it has allowed us to be able to do something that I'm going to describe in the next couple of slides that is related to what we call purchase to pay. So we've created an entire purchase to pay solution with TimberScan, and it really evolved from the acquisition through AvidXchange. So just a brief information about Avid. As you see, over 1,600 employees, 7 offices across the United States, 8,000 customers. I think it's also important to note that you'll see in the middle of these this second area here, 825,000 suppliers paid. So when I talked about the purchase to pay, not only does titanium allow you to be able to manage the AP workflow process, but it also allows for you to be able to execute and automate the payment process as well. And a lot of that heavy lifting of the payment side comes in through the integration with the AvidPay network. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I think it's important just to note that obviously we have been doing this for quite a long time, and the beauty of being able to merge our two technologies into one inside titanium allows us to really expand our reach. So let's talk about purchase to pay. And the idea and the concept behind purchase to pay is to be able to have one place to retrieve everything associated with an invoice. And how we achieve that are through the items that you're going to see here as they pop up. So the first is, what did we purchase? So let's just say, for example, that a purchase order is created. It doesn't matter whether that purchase order was created in Acumatica itself, or perhaps it was created outside of Acumatica. Titanium has the ability to take that information associated with the purchase order and meld it with the invoice and do in essence, do a three-way match, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in addition to what we purchased, we also want to know what did we receive. So now we're talking, we've created a purchase order. Perhaps we've also created a receiver against that particular purchase. And now, as we are invoiced, we are able to then match the invoice information against the purchase order and receiver, again, for the purposes of that three-way match. Who approved the billing? Was it, a project manager? Was it someone that, outside of the realm of just, let's say a project? Maybe it, was a property manager or someone else. But we want to know the person or people that approved that billing, and we also want to know how that particular invoice was coded. So we're going to get into that whole concept of invoice comes in, perhaps the invoice is sent off to the approvers, and the approvers do the coding. Once that coding and approval process is done, then we step to the payment status. So now we're talking about, we've already done we've already managed the invoice on what I refer to as the front end, but now the invoice has updated Acumatica with all of your financial information. And now we want to take that next step and we want to automate the pay. So these last two items are the status of the payment and how is it paid. Because with the Avid Pay Network, we have numerous choices with which we can choose to be able to execute that payment. And we'll talk about that as we get into the application a little bit deeper. The last slide that I want to show is a workflow depiction of what typically takes place with an invoice and a payment through TimberScan Titanium. And what I'm going to do when I go into the application is I'm going to follow these steps that you see here, in essence, simulating what would happen when an invoice arrives at your door, which is step one. We're going to go through the process of acquiring that invoice or invoices. So we'll talk about that. But once the invoices are acquired, then we're going to go to initial data entry. So what happens is that we don't actually send the invoice off to the approver first. We start the invoice by, in essence, in accounts payable. So someone in accounts payable is reviewing the invoice, perhaps putting in some information if OCR wasn't able to capture it. And then once that data has been initially entered, then it gets sent off to the approvers. That's where the approver comes in, reviews it, and potentially codes the invoice. There is a final review step. That's designed, most of our clients design that primarily because the person or people approving and who's going to be actually responsible for updating Acumatica and the financials, in many cases are different groups, different people. So the approvers here, as I described earlier, might be someone like a project manager on a job, whereas the final reviewer is typically accounting. So the invoice originates in accounting, goes off to be approved, and then before it gets updated into Acumatica, it usually returns to accounting for that final review. Once Acumatica has been updated, not only does it send over the data, but it also sends over any attachments and the images associated with them. And then finally, the last step in this process, as I've described earlier, is that payment process. So now we're able to it's replaced what would normally happen by printing checks, and we're able to take that information and we're able to capture that, pull it back into Titanium and manage the payment process and then release those payments to the AvidPay network. So I'm going to go through each of these steps inside the application, and we're going to walk through each one in quite a bit of detail. And then once we're finished with this, we will pause and we'll open it up for any questions. So let's go ahead in. Okay, so I have already logged into Titanium. We're going to start with this view here. So Titanium is a cloud-based application, runs in a browser, just like Acumatica. Tightly integrated to Acumatica. That's one of the key attributes of the application, which we're going to talk about that integration here as we go. But it functions in much the same way as Acumatica. So you notice how, all of your menu items are over here on the side panel. As you select a menu item, it brings up the sub menus associated with that. And then you execute from here, and it opens up that function into the main body of the application. Now, I opened up, sorry, there's a little bit of an issue here, and I apologize, where we set a timeout to every 15 minutes. So if I am not actually working on the application, I get timed out, and it pushes me back to the login. But now you get to see how you log into the application. Pretty straightforward. So one of the things I want to talk about up front before we actually go in and start managing an invoice is the dashboard functionality. So you notice here I've logged in, my dashboard is open. It's telling me that what we have outstanding for all users, everyone in the organization, we have 19 outstanding invoices, $115,000 is our total payable amount. And obviously these invoices all need to be approved and processed because everything is overdue at this point. Now, beyond that, we also kind of push down to the widgets here, some key information such as invoices by vendor. In this case, I'm logged into a project database, so you're seeing what we're displaying by project, by cost code, who it's assigned to, and then we have other options here in our various panels that you can look up and you can start to view information associated with them. What's nice about the dashboard is that you can view this in a number of different ways. And what I mean by that is I could, from here, if as an administrator, because I have access to be able to see everyone, I could start to drill down. If I wanted to look specifically at a particular person and see how many outstanding invoices they have, I quickly jump to their view. I see what they have outstanding, and then you notice how on the widgets, the pie charts here allow me to be able to scroll around the pie chart, and I'm able to display who the vendor is, what the dollar amount is. So we can start to really get into a bit of detail, and we can get into more detail as we get further down here. But for this purpose, basically as an administrator, I'm able to see everything associated with this particular person. Maybe this is an approver. And at the same time, I can see, basically all the users, everybody that's associated with the application. So nice way to just kind of be able to quickly get a 20,000 foot view, a snapshot of what we have outstanding without, having to run a series of reports, inquiries, or anything like that. Now, of course, if I were an approver, for example, and I'm only supposed to be looking at my invoices or my projects, then when I log in, I'm only going to see my view. I'm not going to be able to see everyone like the administrator can do, as you see here. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's start into the workflow process. And we're going to start at the point where an invoice arrives at your door. Regardless of how you receive that invoice, to acquire it, you go through, under data entry, the acquire step. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in these two fields, and I'll talk about what I'm doing here in a second. Basically, I'm going to I'm going to go out and I'm going to start acquiring some invoices. So there are several ways I can do that. I can drag and drop. So if I had an invoice or invoices that were in a file, maybe something got emailed to me, I want to just drag and drop that email, I can go ahead and do that. So I'll take an invoice here. We'll just go ahead and pull it in. And we'll say continue. And you notice how it brings up the invoice here in the view. So now, basically what I'm seeing, here's that first invoice. I have all of my annotation controls here at the top. So if I wanted to make the invoice larger or smaller, I can do so. You also have the option of opening up the thumbnail. Now, this is a multi-page document, so you're seeing all of the succeeding pages in the thumbnail view here. And if, for example, page 2 was a separate invoice from page 1, you can just right-click, you can split. So you notice how I just separated those 2 pages. So it's that simple, that easy to be able to pull the documents in, split them if I need to, make any annotations if I wanted to, and then hit the acquire button, and acquiring will then drop those invoices into the AP invoice entry queue, which we're going to go to in a few moments. So that's one option. The second option would be invoices that arrive in the mail. For those invoices, what will happen is you would put them onto your scanning device, and you're going to scan them to a titanium file, and then all you have to do is just retrieve all of those invoices out of the file at one time. So it's very simple. We're just saying, let's take that stack of invoices that came in, we open the mail, we put them onto our scanner, we scan to our titanium file, and then we just pull them out of there. Now, somewhat similar, and what a lot of clients have done is they've established an AP email address where they've asked vendors and subs to email their invoices. When that occurs, Titanium has an email monitoring tool, and it works in 2 ways. So the first option is I can come in here, and so let's pull this up like this. Let's say that we're going to go and acquire some invoices. And then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to open that file. That's somewhere in here. Let's say, well, we can just take anything. We'll just pretend here. We'll just take a couple of items here, and we'll pull them in. And there's my emailed file. Here are my emailed invoices here. And then when I'm ready, I just go ahead and I hit the acquire button again, and I've acquired those invoices into the AP invoice entry queue. So instead of me having to go out and monitor an email address and drag and drop each individual invoice from the email address to this screen or to a file and then open up the file, I can just basically have the system behind the scenes grab those attachments, drop them into the file, and then I just open up the file and everything's there lined up in front of me. Now back here, what I've been doing is I've been selecting who I'm going to assign the invoices to initially, and I've been saying what type of document I'm going to be acquiring. And of course, I'm acquiring invoices. So basically what we're saying here, and if you think back to the PowerPoint slide, we're not sending the invoices off to the approvers yet. We're starting an AP invoice entry. So that's what I'm doing. I'm saying who in AP entry is going to get them. This could be a person, it could be a group of people, it doesn't matter. And then what types of documents are we acquiring? In this case, they are invoices. And then I determine whether it's drag and drop, we pull them from the file, or how we acquire them. So I mentioned that there are kind of 2 different options with the email monitoring. So the first is, as I just said, we would let the invoices drop into a file here, and then I open up the file and I pull them out. But we also have something called auto acquire. And what auto acquire does is it allows me to acquire invoices from an email address without anyone having basically any user intervention, and it will drop the invoices directly into AP invoice entry. So how it works, I'm going to use this example here. Let's say I'm getting invoices from Payne Electric. So in this case, they're coming into my AP email address. I'm going to automatically assign them to where they need to go in AP entry. If Payne Electric sent me more than one invoice in a batch, there's probably something such as some text, invoice one of, or something like that, that will indicate that I have more than one invoice. So I need to be able to split them somehow. And then if I've set up any type of OCR for this particular vendor, it will find the information from that particular OCR and it will drop it directly associated with that particular vendor into the AP invoice entry queue. So to summarize, basically what I could do is I could take invoices from certain vendors, for example, that came in by email. I never had to touch anything. I didn't have to open the mail. I didn't have to scan them. I didn't even have to acquire them from a file or drag and drop. The system did all of that for me behind the scenes, and it dropped those invoices directly into my AP invoice entry queue. So that's how the auto acquire works. And just kind of a summary of how the acquire process works altogether. So once invoices have been acquired, let's go to AP invoice entry next. I'm going to show a couple of different options here. I'm going to start with this invoice down here. And one of the things that I wanted to show is, first of all, let's talk about the AP invoice entry queue itself. So what you have is you have the invoice image in front of you here in the upper part of the window. You have your data entry grid down here in the lower part of the window. And then you have a series of action buttons on the taskbar down here at the bottom. Now you notice how part of the image is cut off. Even though I have the image available to me to be able to see, part of it's cut off by the data entry grid. But you have a lot of flexibility here. So what I could do potentially is I could say, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to hit this change mode option. And now what I've done is I've moved that particular that data entry grid to the other side of the screen, where I have the image in full view on one side and my data entry on the other. Let's go ahead and bring it back. Another thing that I can do is I can take this invoice, and if I'm working on dual screens, I can just disconnect it and I can send it off to my second screen. So now I've got the invoice on one screen, I've got my data entry on the other. To bring it back, you just hit this little down arrow and back it comes. Now a third thing, all of these fields are aligned in the exact same order as they are in Acumatica. So we did that because we wanted to create a commonality, a common place for you to go and process your invoices that replicates what would happen in Acumatica. And all of the same rules and all of the same functions are all available to you here, just like they would be in Acumatica, all the way down to having the ability to customize the fields if you need to. You can even set up custom routing fields here. You can move columns around if you choose to, if you don't want to keep them in the same order. So for example, if I want this, to be moved over here, I can do that. We do have the whole concept of multi-currency. If you're, processing invoices, that are not necessarily with US dollars. Some of the other things that we do, we also used our OCR tool with a combination of AI and machine learning. So what I've done here, we have something in our OCR called Smart Extraction. And you notice how, as I've opened up this invoice, that several of the fields have already been filled in and they're highlighted. So the invoice number, which in the case of Acumatica, that's the vendor reference. You've got your billing date, which is also somewhere here. Invoice date. You've got your due date, which is also filled in. So these fields have already been populated, and they came directly from what we call the Smart Extraction part of OCR. Now, another thing that the system does is it allows you to be able to, if you needed to, add fields on the fly to the OCR. An example of that would be, for example, the vendor. So let's say that I had acquired the Payne Electric invoice and the system did not recognize that particular vendor. So there are some AI tools where I would have to acquire this invoice, 10, 15, 20, could be 50 times before it finally starts to learn and understand that it's a Payne Electric invoice. In the first pass, if it didn't recognize this Payne Electric invoice, I can just go ahead. I can search the vendor file and find Payne Electric, and all of these master files are all linked to Acumatica. And then I can just hit the plus sign, and I've just added that particular field to this particular vendor's OCR. So from this point forward, I don't have to worry about having the system to try and recognize Payne Electric. I just hit the plus sign on that first pass, and now every invoice that comes in after that, it's going to automatically recognize Payne Electric. Some of the other things that we do. You can use these tooltips. So you notice how I've got a tooltip here for Payne Electric. Now that's a user that's kind of restricted, but let's go look at a different user here. Bear with me 1 second. Let's bring this guy up. Hopefully I didn't get logged out. I didn't. Okay. So you see the types of things that I can display in these little inquiry or these tooltips here. I'm actually going out to Acumatica. I'm looking at, for example, the purchase order, and I'm bringing up the committed amount, what has been invoiced so far, and the balance. If I'm looking at a project, notice how I've changed some of the column headings. There's another option you can do here. So on the case of the project, I can see what the current contract amount is, what we've invoiced to date, what the balance is, what the budget is. These are all things that are available to me right here on the screen. I don't have to go out and I don't have to do an inquiry or any of that. It's all basically just contained. And again, it speaks to that deep integration that we have with Acumatica, where it's retrieving that information from Acumatica right here on the fly. I don't have to go anywhere to see any of this. It's all available to me right here. Now, in addition to all of that, another thing that you can do is you can search for history on any field. So when I'm here, if I wanted to go out and say, what are all the invoices associated with Payne Electric? I hit the history button, and now I have all of those invoices. And this is laid out in a grid. So I've got a lot of detail here, lots of things that I can look at and view. But I also have all of my invoice images available to me. So if I wanted to just look at the invoice, I can. If I want to go one step further and I want to actually see how it's been coded, I can call up all of my line items associated with that particular entry, and I'm able to see how it was coded right from here. Same thing with a project. So if I happen to look at a project code, which I'm going to bring up something a little bit different here in a moment. But any one of these fields, even no matter what it is, I can see all the invoicing for the branch. I can do pretty much anything here. And it just pulls it right up on the screen with all of my invoice detail. Let's back up for 1 second. Let's look at a different invoice. And this is an invoice where we've referenced a purchase order. Now, the smart extraction can actually go to the level where not only could it find the invoice number, the invoice date, the due date, but it can also find the purchase order. So in this case, it referenced the purchase order that was created in Acumatica. It pulled it up here, and it automatically pulled in the line items for me, or it pulled up the line items and allowed me to be able to go through and view each of the items here if I wanted to. Now, if I hadn't been able to reference the purchase order from the invoice, what you can do is you can always say add PO. You can say add PO. You can go right down to the line item level of the PO. You can do receipts. And anytime you're attaching a purchase order and or receiver, the system will not only pull up and retrieve the line items from the PO and receiver for you to be able to compare against the invoice, but it will also automatically attach the documents. So now we're talking about this consistent three-way match where I'm able to retrieve and grab not only the purchase order lines, the receiver lines, and the invoice lines, but I'm also able to compare all of that against the invoice, and everything came in, for me here. And then, as I mentioned before, if I wanted to, let's go down to, for example, GL account, we've got project in here. So again, if I wanted to be able to look at the project and do the history on the project, it's all available to me. And then I can start to get into my detail here, see the line item coding for all of that. Okay. So we've talked about kind of the basics of the invoice, the entry. We've talked about matching an invoice to a purchase order and receiver, pulling up the line items for the PO/receiver, doing that three-way match process. And now the invoice has been coded. Obviously, I can override anything here if I needed to. But if I'm ready, I can take that invoice and I can hit save and route, and it will route that invoice off to the approvers. Now, how it goes to the approver is based on the workflow that you design basically behind the scenes. Now, the workflow can be as simple or as complex as you need it to be. So if I wanted, for example, to route this invoice off to, let's say, the project manager for a particular project, I can do that. If I wanted to go one step further and say we need to route this to multiple people, obviously you can go to as many people as needed. The routing is so elaborate that what you can do is you can route on any field that you see here in the invoice entry screen. So if I wanted to route by inventory ID, by branch, by whatever it might be, by GL account code, by obviously by project, by cost code, whatever it is, I can use that as my routing criteria when I set up my workflow. In addition, if you have thresholds, you can set up thresholds where invoices get escalated up to another level of approval based on dollar amounts and things like that. We also have the concept of what we call job authorization. So again, this is project-based here. But if I had set up a project manager in the job or in the project file in Acumatica, the system can pull that data directly from Acumatica so that I don't have to basically do anything here with my workflow setup. It just looks at the project or looks at the project manager and says, okay, just go ahead and assign it to that particular person if need be. And I think I also mentioned earlier, you can also do custom routing on the fly if you needed to for whatever purpose. Okay, so those are the basics of AP invoice entry. Very, elaborate, very flexible, allowing you to use and utilize OCR, and also being able to do that three-way match process of matching the invoice against PO and receiver. Once we've routed that particular invoice, we're going to go to the next step, which I'm going to become an approver now. So I'm going to open up my workflow task queue. I only have a couple of invoices that are routed to me. Now, in this particular case, these two invoices, I'm looking at them, you notice in this what's called kind of like a card view. I can change this to a grid. So if I wanted to look at this more like an Excel spreadsheet grid and just go down through and check off which ones I want to approve right now, I can do that. But what I could do here on the card view that you see is that if I wanted to just, as I'm starting to kind of scroll down through some of the details of this particular invoice, if I see that there's enough information here for me to be able to just go ahead and approve it, I could go ahead and do so right here on the screen. I don't have to go any further. Now, second, in addition to that, what I could also do is I could look at this and say, well, wait a minute. This is for a particular project, or it's a particular vendor that I don't work with. So I could just reject it from here as well. If I reject it, I'm going to have to put a reason in as to why I did that. Now, let's say that I'm going to just go a little bit further. I'm going to actually go into the invoice itself. And again, what I'm able to do here is, and this is not going to be easy for me to do, but I'm going to try to simulate this somewhat by shrinking the screen down and basically showing you that what I'm able to do is, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to make it bigger again, is I can, on any type of device, I have the ability to go through and approve the invoice. So in this case, if I were on a phone, if I'm on an iPad, I'm out of the office, it doesn't matter. I'm able to simply come in here and I can look at my detail. If I want to look at my line items and say, here's an item that I need a code or whatever. In this case, I'm restricted as an approver to only being able to code the cost code. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug in a cost code here, and it selects that particular cost code, attaches it to the invoice, and and then I'm ready to proceed forward here. I've got all my coding information here, action items at the bottom. But the idea, and again, I'm going to make this larger again because it's not easy to be able to simulate here. I could probably just pull this up on my phone and use Reflector, but I just thought it would be easier, save some time to kind of explain that. The system will basically right size to any device. So I'm able to send an invoice off to an approver. They can pull it up on their phone and they can go through and they can approve it. They can reject it. They could put that invoice on hold. They can email it off. So they can route, do kind of a route on the fly here. They need to email it off to someone or add notes. They can do that. If I were to put an invoice on hold, and I mentioned also with rejecting, you have to put a reason in as to why you're putting it on hold or why you're rejecting it. If you reject, you can reject back to previous approvers. So in this case, the only other person or group that saw this invoice before it got to me was the initial AP invoice entry. But if this had gone to an approver, for example, and they had already approved it, it came to me, I could reject it back to them, and I'd have to put a note in as to why I'm rejecting it back. So it doesn't have to go all the way back to where it originated. As I mentioned, you can email from here, but those are kind of the basics of the approval process and how that works. Now, what will happen is that if we go back to the PowerPoint slide, I had mentioned that most of our clients have set up a final review step. So what would happen is I'm, let's say, a project manager, I go ahead and approve the invoice. It's probably going to go to someone else who's going to be the final reviewer. They would come into their task queue. They would call up the invoice. They would review it, make sure everything's been coded properly, and then when they approve it, it will send that invoice to Acumatica fully coded. When it gets to Acumatica, what it does is it not only does it update the data, but it also sends with it all of the images. So from here, if I wanted to, whoops, time out. Okay. I can just go ahead, I can open up that particular invoice and, whoops. Should allow me to open. For some reason, it's not opening at the moment. Interesting. Let's try this. But basically what it does is it attaches the invoice and any of the supporting documents so that if I were in Acumatica, I'm able to see that particular invoice just like, as if the invoice originated there. So it's sending over that invoice image and it's sending over any of the supporting documents that go along with it. All the way down to the payment record. And that's where we're going to go next. So when it comes to payment, that process is going to start the exact same way that it does today. So you're going to go into your checks and payments function. And then when you do that, what we've done is we've built a tool inside Acumatica that allows us to be able to grab what would normally be sent to a printer. And we're able to pull that data back into TimberScan Titanium, and you can manage the payment through there. Now, why would we do that? Well, the simple answer is that it eliminates you from having to print checks. Now, once it gets to Titanium, let's go back in here. We have the pay control and the pay inquiry. So if I'm in Titanium, I can call up my payments that I've generated. And what we do is we simulate what would normally be sent to a printer. So I have my check here at the bottom of the screen, my payment stub here at the check stub at the top. And then the invoices that check is paying are here in the middle. It's just one invoice in this case. But if this is the case, what I can do is it will not only show me what looks like a check, but it automatically attached the invoice image and any of the supporting documents. And you notice this third document here is an approval page. This is something that Titanium attaches to every single invoice. So it's basically an audit log that shows you everything associated with the invoice from the time it was received, entered, and approved. So you're able to see all of that data. But back here, so here's the concept. If you have a scenario where someone prints a batch of checks and then they have to attach the check to the invoice and supporting documents and perhaps hand that off to someone, for that person to have to then go through and approve the payment, then this is a tool that would allow you to do that. Now, this can also be viewed in a grid format. I'm just showing you kind of the more of the detailed view. Now, if I go ahead and I say I'm going to go ahead and approve this payment, it's going to release it to the Avid Pay Network. And basically what will happen is that when it gets to the Avid Pay Network, if we go back and you think about that PowerPoint slide where I was talking about the power of Avid Exchange and the over 825,000 vendors that we work with, those are vendors that we worked with other clients where they're in our quote unquote network. So where chances are, if we send this payment to the Avid Pay Network, many of your payments, many of your vendors, we've already been working with. We know how they want to be paid. And there are basically three options with which the vendor can choose. They can be paid by virtual card, 16-digit merchant card. They can be paid by what we call Avid Pay Direct, which is similar to ACH, or they can be paid by check. Some vendors still want to be paid by check. But we basically manage all that. We absolve you of any issues with check fraud, and we go ahead and execute the payment on your behalf. Now, of course, there are a couple of other options here. I could put this payment on hold if I decided, we're waiting for, a compliance issue to be resolved or something like that, and then use the notification system to be able to continually notify while, that payment is on hold. All right, so let's say we've gone ahead and we've made that payment. Now we also have the pay inquiry. What the pay inquiry does is this allows us to be able to see a transaction. I'm going to look at, let's just take AA. Well, let's take AA services here. So I'm seeing the details of here's the check number that was issued from Acumatica. Here's the dollar amount. I've got how that vendor chose to be paid. So they were paid by virtual card. It shows me that it's processed. Well, in this case, it's been cleared. And then what I could do is, let's say that they call up and they say, Ace Construction says, well, we didn't get the payment yet. I can open up this proof of payment document and I could just send it off to them. And this proof of payment document also gets automatically attached to the invoice. So you know, when you print checks, I'd have to take that check and I'd have to attach it to the invoice. In this case, the proof of payment is automatically attached. And then finally, what I can also do is click on this little plus sign, and this shows me every iteration of that payment process. So from the time it was released to the Avid Pay Network, I see everything that took place. So I think of this as kind of like the UPS tracking. Everything that's going on behind the scenes with respect to, we released it to the Avid Pay Network, and then they're going about paying that particular vendor. I can see exactly what happened. So there's no loss of control here. You're basically controlling everything from the time that you decide you want to release the payments through the, through managing it after it's already been released. Everything's available to you. Okay, I'm going to finish with two items. One of them is I started to touch on the notification system. So this can be used in a number of different ways. You can send off notifications when vendors are routed to approvers. Basically, when any document can be routed to an approver. But you can also use it for alerts and things like that. So you notice how I've got one called initial notification and another one's when an invoice gets rejected. So with my initial notification, I determine what the message is that I want to send. I determine, how often I want to alert someone that they have an invoice that needs to be, processed. And I can also set up alerts, as I mentioned, where I could alert someone and say, invoices have been with you for greater than 5 days or something like that. And, please get the invoice processed as soon as possible. So all of that is available to you, not only, as I said, the initial notification, ongoing notifications for other purposes such as rejecting or what have you, but also alerts anywhere along the way. You're determining the message, you're also determining how often. And then finally, the inquiries are very elaborate. So if I wanted to do an invoice status inquiry, notice all the different things that I can choose here to be able to go in and do an inquiry or build my own query here. And then if I do that, I can hit the report button, and I could potentially download through Excel, PDF, or zip with a report and take the images with me. So if I had, let's say, an audit, and I needed to get all of the invoices for a particular project or a vendor or something like that, it would take me literally seconds to build a query, go out and select what it is that I want to see here, and then be able to then go ahead and download all that information. And when I download it, it's going to look like, let's get that. Oh, there's a, you know what? I knew this invoice was somewhere when I pulled it, when I clicked on the attachment in Acumatica, and it was hidden behind my other screen. So my apologies there, but this is that invoice image that got attached in Acumatica that I didn't see before because it was hidden, as I mentioned. Let's get out of there. And the report that I was talking about, what it does is it presents the report to me with my header information and then my details, and then behind that, you see all of my invoice images that were attached. Okay. I think, Amy, we are at the point where we could probably open it up for any questions. We've kind of walked through the entire purchase to pay process at this point, and hopefully you saw the efficiencies and how you can do this without having to touch a piece of paper anywhere along the way.
Awesome. Does anyone have any questions for Mike? I know he covered a lot. Quiet group today.
Yes.
Nobody even had any questions throughout, so
Okay.
doesn't look like we have any questions. So I think you were pretty thorough.
All right,
If
perfect.
anybody
Well,
does have questions, I will be sending out an email, as I said, either later today or tomorrow. You know, if questions do arise between now and then, you can reach out to me and I'll get them off to either Mike or someone on the Aktion team. So, well, I thank you, Mike, for your time today, and I thank our customers for joining today, taking time out of their days. And as I said, I'll be following up with an email. And again, thank you, and hope everyone has a great day.
all right, Amy, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Welcome.
Bye-bye
Thank
now.
you. Oh, hold on. Are you still there, Mike?
Yes.
I do have one question. What if payments are made outside the system?
What if payments are made outside the system? Yeah,
I don't
well,
know if it's still
well,
here.
you know what? I guess I could probably answer it this way. When I was talking about the payments being pushed to the AvidPay network, that is not an all-encompassing process. And what I mean by that is you can choose to make payments that don't necessarily go to the AvidPay network. What I was showing was you can do this. You can use the AvidPay network to pay your vendors or what have you, without having to print checks. But if you make payments that are outside of the realm and you wanted to, you know, like somebody came in, walked in the office, and I had to write a check or something like that, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to think of it as it has to be you know, all or nothing.
Okay. We lost the person, but I wrote his name down and I'll make sure he knows that you answered it at the end of before I stopped recordings.
Okay.
But if he does have more questions, I'll have him reach out to somebody. So thank you again, Mike. I appreciate it. And we'll see you, I think in May, maybe we have the next one.
Think so. Yep.
All right. All right. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.